I'm going to stop you right there, Judith, Ellis said, holding up a hand like he was blessing me with his time. Your salary's a luxury we can't afford. We'll have a cheaper team handle the data. I didn't say a word. I didn't blink. Just sat there watching him sign the exit paperwork with a Mont Blanc he probably got as a promotion gift for gutting someone else's department. The same pen I once saw him use to scribble nonsense on a chart during a budget meeting, upside down. I'd spent 11 years at Halvik's Capital, 11 years making sure that every single number matched, not just internally, but across every bank, every auditor, every regulator. My role wasn't in the spotlight. I didn't wow at shareholder meetings. I didn't toss around terms like disruption or synergize. I just verified truth, quietly, relentlessly. You know the tragic thing about doing your job too well? People stop seeing you. They start thinking the machine runs itself, that the gears don't grind, that the ledger updates itself by magic and goodwill. By the way, before we go deeper into this, if you're listening and getting pulled in, do us a quick favor. Tap that subscribe button and like the video. It keeps the stories coming, and it honestly means more than you know to the team behind the scenes. Now, back to Ellis and his exit papers. He slid them across the table like he was doing me a favor. Smiled too. One of those corporate smirks that says, I've already won. I gave him my transition checklist, a full documentation packet, printed, signed, time-stamped. I saw him glance at the first line, then flip it shut. We'll be fine, he said. Data's data. No, Ellis, it's not. But I didn't correct him. Didn't tell him that the reports he was about to outsource only looked complete on the surface, that buried beneath every clean row was a framework, one I had built by hand, a series of hash verification layers tied to compliance tokens that didn't exist in any official system. Not because I was hiding them, because no one ever asked. My job title was Custodian of Financial Continuity. Sounds dull, doesn't it? Like I babysat spreadsheets all day. But what it meant was this. When the Office of Regulatory Assurance came knocking, or when JP Morgan ran a quarterly recon, they didn't trust the output. They trusted the process. My process. I wasn't a node in the system. I was the system. But Ellis? Ellis was all flash and forward momentum. His kind came and went like marketing fads. Cut costs, inflate quarterly reports, get out before the damage shows. And someone like me, a quiet woman in her 50s who didn't network or play politics, luxury. It wasn't even insulting. Not really, just predictable. I packed my things in silence. One box, a mug, a framed printout of the first audit report that passed without a single correction, the baseline checksum binder, unsigned copies, nothing proprietary, just sentiment. I didn't look back when I walked out. No tears, no drama, just that subtle sense, like an engineer walking out of a building where she knows the wiring's been stripped, the breakers are mismatched, and nobody's noticed the ticking. You ever feel that? That low hum under the surface when something is about to go sideways but nobody else can hear it? I heard it in that office, as I dropped my badge into the tray and passed security on the way out. The part they never understood, the thing Ellis and his cheaper team never once considered, is that data doesn't just live in servers. It lives in trust, in the people who know where the signatures are buried, in the ones who remember why line 47 needs an override before recon can pass compliance. But he wouldn't learn that yet. Not until the numbers stopped making sense. Not until the banks started calling. Not him, but the board. Not until someone whispered, "Where's Judith?" And someone else replied, "We let her go." That sound you hear in the silence, that's the ledger breathing without me. And soon, it's going to choke. Ellis Dorn arrived like a gust of hot air and buzzwords, fresh off the plane from a fintech startup where they wore hoodies to board meetings and fired people via Slack emojis. He strutted into Halvik's like he'd been summoned to rescue us from our own unsexy efficiency. I remember his first all hands like a sermon from a preacher who'd never prayed. He stood in front of 300 analysts, accountants, and risk officers and told us the future was agile, modular, scalable, that legacy roles would be reevaluated, that data operations will be modernized through strategic outsourcing. Translation: bodies are expensive and experience doesn't fit in a slide deck. I was sitting in row 4. I didn't clap. You learn after enough fiscal years to hear what isn't being said. Ellis wasn't speaking to us. He was performing for the board, for the shareholders, and for the next job he'd jump to in 18 months if the building didn't catch fire before then. 2 weeks later, I was called to HR. No lead up, no sit down with my manager, just an Outlook invite labeled Transition Meeting Final Review. No, thank you for your service. No plaque. Just Ellis in a glass room with a stack of forms and that Mont Blanc again, twirling it like a game show host holding the final answer card. Judith, he said, drawing out my name like he was tasting it. We've reviewed the data ops budget. Your role is important, was important, but frankly, it's become a luxury. I waited. We've already engaged LineScope. He continued. A lean international team that specializes in back-end continuity. They're hungry, fast, scalable, fraction of the cost. I didn't blink, just reached into my bag and handed him a folder. What's this? My transition checklist, I said. He opened it, flicked through the first few pages. Framework inventory, key custodial logs, reconciliation flag maps, legacy tokens, and associated audit trails. He closed it before page 6. Smirked like a man who thinks documentation is for underachievers. We won't need all that, he said. They've already got access to the data. I almost laughed. That's like saying you've got access to a city because you printed the street names off Google Maps. He slid the papers toward me. I'll need your signature confirming knowledge transfer. I signed. Dated. Even added a note, finalized per CFO directive, custodial logs surrendered per policy. That last line? That wasn't for Ellis. That was for the auditor who would come knocking in the next cycle, wondering why Field 243 didn't pass checksum. I stood up, slid the pen back to his side of the table. If there's anything else, there won't be, I said. Good luck, Ellis. He nodded, already turning to his inbox. As I walked out, I passed one of the junior compliance analysts. She looked up from her desk, confused. I gave her a small smile. She wouldn't understand yet, but she'd be one of the first to feel the fallout. Because Ellis didn't just fire a legacy role. He deleted the map while assuming the roads would stay in place. But that's the thing about continuity. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It's just the quiet hum that keeps the machine from catching fire. And once it stops humming, you'll hear everything else start to break. LineScope came with shiny sales decks and buzzwords in 12-point Helvetica, precision at scale, global compliance alignment, cloud-native continuity. Their reps smiled wide, wore matching polos, and talked like they'd just discovered data integrity over brunch. They weren't bad people, just blind to the nuance. Ellis handed them the keys like he was tossing a rental to a valet. They've got everything, he told the board. Full database access, audit trail permissions, schema documentation. We're covered. Almost. See, buried beneath the visible systems, the dashboards, the pipelines, the sanitized SQL scripts, there was something deeper. Something no offshore vendor would think to ask for because it wasn't on any map. I built it the year after an auditor cornered me in a glass room and asked, Judith, how do we really know your numbers match the bank's? Like, provably, immutably? That question haunted me in the best way, so I built something invisible, a checksum framework not tied to outputs, but to intent. It mapped ledger trails to compliance tokens, each token authenticated by a tri-party sign-off system, Halvik's internal custodian, a me, corresponding bank liaison, and an external auditor seal, not an app, not a database module, a logic lattice buried in the folds of our compliance assumptions. It lived in batch scripts, custom hash functions, a little daemon process that checked for variance and timestamp drift, and silently raised flags if things slipped. None of it ever failed, because I never let it. And when Ellis's team asked for access, they got the databases, sure, the S3 buckets, the dashboard configs, but not the index, because Ellis didn't know it existed. And I wasn't about to bring it up just to have it ignored again. He didn't ask. He didn't know what to ask, because in his mind, data's data, which is like saying a parachute's just fabric. So I walked. Clean, quiet. Left behind a sanitized shell that looked functional from the outside, like a house with all the lights on and nobody home. On my last afternoon, I pulled one final copy of the most recent signed checksum baseline, not the actual framework, just the snapshot, one that proved what the data looked like the last time it was true. I didn't do it to be spiteful, didn't do it to sabotage. I did it because someone had to remember what integrity felt like before Ellis replaced it with efficiency. Let him run his experiments. Let Linescope strut around with their dashboards and slide decks. I had built my exit quietly, seamlessly, like slipping a steel beam out from under a skyscraper. No noise, no damage. Not yet. But wait long enough, and gravity will handle the rest. 3 weeks. That's how long it took before the first tremor hit. At first, everything seemed fine, at least on the surface. Linescope's team flooded Slack channels with status updates. Sync complete. Audit report generated. No anomalies detected. They even sent Ellis a slick dashboard with pie charts and color-coded health metrics. He presented it in the Monday leadership call like a toddler showing off a macaroni collage. See, he beamed, we've modernized, 0 downtime. Then came Thursday. The first call came from a mid-level compliance officer at Northeast Savings, just a routine quarterly pre-verification check. Their protocol was simple. Validate internal numbers against the checksum signature we'd submitted in the previous cycle. But this time, it bounced. 3 fields. Marked inconsistent. That's all it took. They flagged it. Sent a follow-up request for clarification. No panic, yet. But anyone who's ever dealt with bank audits knows that inconsistent is a loaded word. It doesn't just mean something didn't match. It means the trust thread has started to fray. By Friday morning, Ellis was already spinning. He called it a formatting issue, blamed a mismatch in timestamp precision, told them Linescope was rolling out a patch. But the bank didn't back down. Instead, they ran a deeper check. And then another discrepancy appeared. This time in the fixed asset register, and then another, this one in a liquidity report tied to our credit facility baseline. The calls multiplied. First Northeast Savings, then Trimark, then Fidelity Capital. The phrase started echoing across inboxes. Baseline ledger mismatch detected. I wasn't there, obviously, but one of the junior analysts I used to mentor, Anita, sent me a message from her personal email. They're scrambling. No one knows what baseline ledger signature actually means. Did you ever document that? I didn't reply, because I had. It was in the transition checklist, page 7. Ellis never got past page 5. By week 2, the CTO got pulled in, tried to calm things down, assumed it was just a sync error or a corrupted ETL job. They pulled the Git repo searching for the checksum function. Found nothing. Checked the data warehouse for flag logic. Blank. Rerouted queries through the BI tool. No trace of ledger lock comparisons. They kept digging. Opened archived release notes. Cross-referenced JIRA tickets. Sifted through outdated Confluence pages. Still nothing. Because what they were looking for wasn't a tool. It was a trust pattern. And that's not something you can grep for. That's when the banks escalated. Northeast Savings fired the warning shot. Until baseline reconciliation is confirmed by prior custodian authority, we are temporarily suspending further credit line expansion. Ellis panicked. Pulled a late-night meeting with vendor support. Linescope tried to explain that they'd followed protocol. Their job was to process what they were given, not conjure trust from thin air. And then someone on the board got a call, followed by another, and then another. You know what banks hate more than bad numbers? Silence. Because silence means nobody's steering the ship, and the icebergs are getting closer. Back at Halvix, the panic started to bloom. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. Because for all the dashboards, for all the outsourced dashboards and consultant swagger, one truth remained. No one, not Ellis, not Linescope, not even the CTO, knew where the original trust lived. They thought they inherited a system. What they got was a ghost. And she wasn't answering their calls. It was a junior risk analyst, someone 6 months into the job, still green enough to read every policy doc top to bottom, who finally found it. She was combing through archived onboarding materials for a completely unrelated inquiry when she spotted a line buried halfway down a PDF titled Continuity Protocols, Legacy Functions. The line read, Custodial ledger baseline index, maintained by internal custodian, compliance mapped, not system integrated. No links, no script name, no path, just that note. And beneath it, my initials, signature, date stamp, March 18th, 3 years ago. The doc had been included in the transition packet Ellis signed when I was pushed out. Page 7 of 15. By the time it landed on his desk again, this time from the audit chair instead of a compliance intern, his face was already red. "Why wasn't I told about this?" he snapped. The audit chair didn't blink. "It's literally in the handover doc you initialed. You wrote noted, custodian functions terminated." He tried to pivot. "Then why didn't IT flag it?" The CTO leaned back and folded her arms. "Because it's not a system function. It's a custodial process. You remove the custodian." That's when the real question landed. A board member leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Can the new team recreate it?" The silence that followed was longer than it should have been. Finally, the compliance officer said, "Not without the original baseline and token map. The signatures don't reconcile." "Where is the original?" another board member asked. Another silence. Then, she took her final copy with her. Per policy, she's allowed to keep an unsigned record. The signed one? We never made another. Ellis's jaw tightened. "So what? You're saying we can't regenerate trust from our own systems?" The CTO answered that one. "Judith didn't build systems. She built assurance. Those checksum layers weren't code. They were protocol logic, auditable, traceable, external-facing logic. And she maintained the only working map." Someone muttered under their breath. "So we don't need the data. We need her." And there it was, that click. That moment when everyone in the room realized what they'd done. They didn't just fire an employee, they amputated their only living connection to institutional trust. Not because I hid anything, not because I sabotaged the handoff, but because no one thought to look past the systems, because I wasn't on the org chart, because my dashboards weren't flashy, because I didn't contribute to innovation. But when the numbers stopped aligning and the ledgers lost their anchor, the absence rang louder than any warning bell. I hadn't buried the truth. They'd just stepped over it. And now, with a dozen banks on hold and 2 credit facilities locked, Halvix Capital was starting to understand that continuity isn't a product, it's a person. And they'd just outsourced her to nowhere. The first real crack wasn't a siren, it was a memo. Subject line, "Temporary suspension of credit assessment activity, immediate compliance directive." Plain English? Every major bank had hit pause. Credit lines frozen, ledger access withheld, liquidity checks bouncing into quarantine. At Halvix Capital, that memo might as well have been a cardiac arrest. Payroll missed its Friday release for the first time in company history. One of the vendor accounts, Tech Harvest, the same firm that managed half of Halvix's reporting tools, issued a service contingency advisory. That's corporate speak for, you don't pay, we don't patch. The panic wasn't loud. It never is at first. It trickles through inboxes, spreads in side-channel slacks, rides the elevators in silent glares. Directors started canceling meetings. Procurement froze. HR prepped the usual talking points. It's a temporary systems issue. While wondering if their own checks would clear. Meanwhile, Ellis did what people like Ellis always do when the ceiling starts to cave in. He scheduled a call with Fidelity Group, trying to smooth talk the analysts who flagged the mismatch in the first place. He didn't get far. They let him ramble through his excuses, something about system modernization and temporary verification lag, until a woman on the Fidelity team cut in. Her voice was flat, bored even. "We're not looking for apologies, Mr. Dorn. We're looking for reconciliation." Pause. "Bring back the custodian, or we notify the Office of Regulatory Assurance." That was it. No threats, no fireworks, just a lever pulled. That night, my phone rang. I recognized the number. Private line, Halvix Tower prefix. But it wasn't Ellis. It was Lorna Clay. Chair of the audit committee, she didn't waste time. "Judith, I assume you're aware of the situation." I said nothing. "We're interested in discussing terms for your return. This time, not as staff." Still, I didn't speak. "We're prepared to reclassify your position. Independent authority, full control over the reconciliation framework, direct reporting to audit. She paused. Would you be willing to listen? I waited a breath longer than necessary, just enough to let the silence work. Send it in writing, I said. There's a shift that happens when someone realizes they're no longer in control, when the person they dismissed without ceremony is now the only one who can grant absolution. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with measured voices, legal language, revisions in governance policy drafts, and suddenly the luxury becomes the only thing keeping the lights on. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just went to my kitchen, poured a glass of cold water, sat at the table and stared at the dim light of the fridge, because leverage isn't loud. It's quiet, clinical, absolute. Ellis had tried to cut continuity out of the budget. Now he was watching the house burn, and the only extinguisher had my name etched on it. He wouldn't be the one to hand it back. He didn't get that right anymore. At 9:15 sharp, I walked through the revolving doors of Halvik's tower with nothing but a tote bag, a clean shirt, and the kind of silence you carry when you no longer owe anyone a damn thing. The receptionist stood up, almost startled. Ms. Callahan? I nodded. She handed me a visitor badge, hands slightly trembling as if she knew this wasn't a regular visit. No one asked for ID. No one called security. They already knew why I was there. An assistant from the 43rd floor met me at the elevators and didn't say a word during the ride, just pressed the button, stood stiff as a file cabinet, and kept her eyes forward. I wasn't escorted. I wasn't processed. I was expected. The boardroom was already full when I walked in. Ellis sat at the far end, pale and tight-jawed, trying to look important by fidgeting with a fountain pen. 2 seats down, the general counsel looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Everyone else wore that particular blend of corporate panic and practiced calm, the look of people who'd gambled with something they didn't understand and lost. Lorna Clay stood and gestured to the seat across from her. Judith, thank you for coming. I sat. No one introduced me, no one welcomed me back, because this wasn't a rehire. This was a reckoning. Lorna opened with the only sentence that mattered. The question before us is not whether to restore the checksum protocol. It's how much authority you require to guarantee it never fails again. That was the shift. This wasn't an apology tour. This was triage. They didn't want me on a team. They wanted me on the firewall between solvency and federal investigation. Ellis cleared his throat once, but didn't speak. He knew better. His name wasn't even on the agenda. The audit chair read out the proposal. A new role. Independent custodian of ledger continuity board level reporting. No subordination to the CFO, CTO, or ops. Full access to all internal and external verification systems. Triple my former salary. A discretionary budget for trust infrastructure redesign. I asked one question. Do I sign contracts now or do I build them? The general counsel answered without flinching. Build them. I nodded once. I accept. No applause, no congratulations. Just a silent acknowledgement that the engine needed fuel, and I was the only one who still had the key. Ellis didn't stand. He didn't object. He just stared at the conference table like it had betrayed him. And maybe it had. He tried to cut cost. What he cut was certainty. I looked at the digital whiteboard. A line from the proposal summary sat frozen on screen. Continuity is not a system. It is a function of memory. I didn't write that line. Someone else did. But they finally understood. They finally saw that trust isn't stored in a database. It's stored in the woman they fired without reading her checklist. And now, she's the one signing theirs. The press release came out on a Tuesday morning, buried just below the market summary. Halvik's Capital announces leadership realignment. CFO Ellis Dorn steps down, citing strategic misalignment. No fanfare, no scandal, just a soft corporate exhale and the quiet closure of a manila folder. Internally, nobody called it what it was, but everyone knew. The man who tried to cut out the organ that kept the company breathing had finally been labeled what he truly was: a miscalculation. His office was cleared in an afternoon, a few awkward glances down the hall, some relieved nods. The HR team didn't even bother to hold an exit interview. They just locked his laptop and moved on. The new CFO arrived later that week. Clean record, soft voice, the kind of person who didn't pretend to know everything. He scheduled 30 minutes with me, said he wanted a tour of the system. I handed him a single page. No diagrams, no passwords, just a straight line. Checksum lives here, tied to verified baseline. External reconciliation signed quarterly. He looked up after reading it twice. This isn't on any roadmap. Correct, I said. It's not a feature, it's trust. And to his credit, he nodded. This won't be documented in Jira or Confluence. You won't find it on a vendor slide deck, I told him. But every institution that touches our books relies on it, and every quarter they verify it through me. Not a dashboard, not a bot. Me. That afternoon, the board met to ratify a change in governance. No custodial protocol may be dissolved, reassigned, or outsourced without written validation from all third-party verification entities. In plain English, you don't fire the person who holds the keys to belief. IT updated system tags. Legal rewrote the contract language. Compliance created a standing ledger audit rotation. HR created a new classification. Institutional trust authority. I was the only one on it. Vendors received the final memo later that week. Data continuity restored. Ledger trust reinstated. All prior discrepancy escalations resolved. I didn't draft it, didn't sign it, but it felt like a seal over a wound. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just the quiet recentering of a structure that had leaned too far toward arrogance and finally snapped back to balance. Ellis left without a fight. Because there's no argument left to make when the system says no louder than you ever could. And now the trust lives in daylight, not in the shadows, and I don't need to defend it. The institution does that for me. A month after the dust settled, after Ellis's name had been quietly scraped off the org chart and the boardroom had returned to its usual sterile calm, I received a letter slipped into my internal mail folder. Actual paper. No return address. Just a folded note with careful handwriting that told me everything I needed to know. Junior, eager, still believes in meaning. Inside it read, they still talk about the week everything froze. Vendors, compliance, even facilities. Like it was some kind of ghost event. How did you know it would happen? That they'd come back to you? I stared at that question for a long time. Then I wrote one line in reply. I didn't. I just verified what they assumed. Assumptions are funny things. They're invisible until they fail. The whole place had run for years on the quiet assumption that the system was the safety, but the system wasn't the safeguard. I was. Not because I was smarter or special, but because I remembered, and I proved. My office now sits on the far corner of the 42nd floor. No window facing the skyline, no award shelf, no trophies. Just a worn wooden desk and a chair that doesn't creak. I chose the spot myself. Out of the way. Quiet. There's no nameplate outside the door. Just a small brass plate on the inside where only I can see it. Continuity lives in silence. That was always the job. Not to build the flashiest system, not to deliver the fastest queries or the prettiest dashboards. Just to ensure that when the questions came, real questions, the kind that make banks freeze credit and regulators raise eyebrows, the answers were already there. Verified. Signed. Unshakable. On the shared drive, there's a folder now. Locked. Read only. Inside it. Checksum R baseline. Protocol. .v3 PDF modified by H. Callahan. Last edit, 12:42 p.m., 2 days after the board vote access. Governance level only, permissions cannot delete. I didn't need to tell anyone what to do with it. They know. Every time a reconciliation cycle rolls around now, that file gets opened, read, acknowledged. Not because it's exciting, not because it's new, but because it's real. Because it means the numbers they're betting careers on, assets, liabilities, forecasts, payments, are backed by something more than hope. Not data, not even the checksum, but belief. That's what I protected. That's what they forgot. And now they remember. No fireworks, no speeches, just quiet gravity. Because in the end, you don't protect data. You protect belief in the data.